Hello, everybody. So, in our last lesson, we were focusing on the different essential resources that we need for life. And we focused on three main resources. We looked at food, we looked at water, we looked at energy. Now, over the course of the coming lessons, we're going to be delving into a bit more detail, a bit more depth about each of these different types of resources that are so essential for life. Today, however, we're going to continue to look at an overview of all three. But before we do, let's just reconnect with some of those questions that we were looking at last lesson. So you've got here 5 questions, which hopefully you should be able to answer on the basis of what we looked at last lesson. So the first one says, how many litres of water do we use daily in our homes? The second question says, how many litres of water does it take to make 1 kilogram of beef? The third question is, how many calories should the average 14-year-old girl consume? Question 4, name a type of fossil fuel. And question 5, what does how much energy you use depend on? Just have a little think about those questions in your head for the next 10 seconds and see what you can remember. Okay then, so for those of you that can remember, let's just go through some responses and answers. So the first one, how many litres of water do we use daily in our homes? We use about 150 litres of water every single day. And that's 150 litres of water. And that includes a lot of the hidden water that we've got. But generally speaking, that's quite a lot. And only a small proportion of that is drinking water, around about 5%. The next question, absolutely staggering. How many litres of water does it take to make a kilogram of beef? It takes 15,500 litres of water to make just 1 kilogram of beef. And that's because you've got to water the crops that you need in order to be able to grow the food to feed the cows in the first place before you've even tried to give some water to keep the beef herd hydrated, or until you've included water within the manufacturing process. Third one, how many calories should the average 14-year-old girl consume? According to World Health Organization guidance, it should be around 1,850 calories per day. The third one, name a type of fossil fuel. Well, there are 3 main ones. There's coal, there's oil, and there's gas. But you could also include burning wood as a fossil fuel as well, because it releases lots of carbon into the atmosphere, and it will eventually run out if we don't replant. And then question 5, what does how much energy you use depend on? It's wealth. The richer we are, the more energy we consume. And that's because we've got more things. We've got more cars, we've got more electronics, we've got more need to be able to use energy on a day-to-day basis. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of continue on from that last question where we looked at this graph, which you can see in front of you. Now, in this graph, which you can see in front of you, we've got 2 axes. We've got our x-axis, which says social and economic well-being. So in other words, how well you're doing socially and how well you're doing in terms of how much money you've got. And then we've got the availability of resources. And we said that we would expect to see a positive correlation. So the wealthier you are, the richer you are, the more resources you've got available to you. Now, we're going to kind of see if that's true today, because we're going to start to look at something which is called the global distribution of resources. So we're going to look at the areas around the world where we would find lots of energy, lots of water, and lots of food. And then we're going to flip it around and we're going to look at the areas around the world where we don't expect to find lots of food, we don't expect to find lots of energy, and we don't expect to find lots of water. So what we're going to look at today is the global distribution of resources. And there's just one key question that I want us to focus on. And it says, how evenly are resources of food, water, and energy distributed around the world? Okay. Now, in order for me to be able to make an assessment of whether or not you can answer that question, there's a target exam style question, which I would like us to have a go at. And it says, explain what figure C tells us about the global distribution of water. Now, that won't make any sense to you at the moment, because we're not looking at figure C. When I've got figure C in front of you, we'll go through it step by step, modeling those steps for success to kind of see if we can use some different types of skills. We're going to start to use some of those mapping and graph skills that are going to be so important for that assessment objective 3 when you get into the exam. So first things first then, if we're going to look at how evenly resources such as food, water, and energy are distributed around the world, I think we need to kind of clear a few things up. So the key question is, how evenly are resources distributed around the world? And I've got some simple bullet points just to give us a starting point. Now, I think it would be pretty obvious to say that resources aren't evenly distributed around the world. There are some areas of the world where we've got lots of access to resources, and there are other areas of the world where we've got very little access to resources. So it says there, resources are unevenly distributed across the world. And we've already talked about social and economic well-being. So HICs, high income countries, have lots of resources and they have a high standard of living, whereas LICs lack resources and struggle to improve the quality of life for their people. Okay, all we've got to do is to look at the lives that we've got around us at the moment. We all live in high income countries. Because we live in a high income country, that means that we've got the benefits of a good standard of living, generally speaking, and reasonable levels of economic wealth. And we've got lots of resources. You know, I can turn the tap on when I want to and it provides me with water. I can flick a light switch and it gives me power and it gives me energy. I can put petrol into my car in order to be able to drive. All of that links into my standard of living. Whereas if you live in a low income country and you don't have access to those resources, it may be that you can't find or you can't get to those resources, or it might be that you can't afford those resources, then you're going to struggle to improve your quality of life. And it's also worth noting that as the population increases and global population is increasing in certain areas of the world, like Africa, we know from doing our population studies that the growth in terms of the population is exponential. It's very, very fast with high birth rates. That puts more of a strain on resources available. Simply put, if you've got more people and you've got the same amount of resources to go around, that has the potential to create problems. So what I'd like you guys to do now is to pause this video, and I want you to make sure that you've got those notes down that you can see on the screen in front of you at the moment. Okay, they're a really important starting point which we're going to build on. So pause the video now then, guys. Excellent. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by looking at the global distribution of food. Now, before we can do that, there are two key words which we need to understand. The first key word here is one that you might have heard. It's called malnourished. Malnourishment is when you don't have enough calories per day to remain healthy. Okay. Now, I typed into Google Images malnourishment, and what comes up overwhelmingly are pictures of children with swollen bellies and rib cages that are on show that are almost always from Africa, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa. Now, those pictures were horrific, and I was actually upset looking at some of the images. And the picture that you can see here of a malnourished child is probably one of the softer images that I could find. But malnourishment happens, and if you're malnourished, you don't have enough calories to remain healthy day to day. There is another word, though, that we need to be aware of, and that's undernutrition. So undernutrition is when you do not have the right minerals and vitamins and a poorly balanced diet. So if we look at this child that you can see here, this child is both malnourished and undernourished. So they suffer from malnourishment and undernutrition. However, it's possible to have access to lots and lots of food, but still be undernourished. So if we look at the diet that you can see on the right-hand side here, you've got lots of processed foods that are very, very high in sugar, very high in fat. Similarly, if you look at this burger that you can see down there, it's made of beef, which is very, very high in fat, which is bad for you in terms of your arteries and the links that it's got to coronary heart disease. So that is still undernourishment because that food is not providing you with the vitamins and minerals that you need on a day-to-day basis to be able to grow and to be healthy. Okay, so it's worth noting that there's a difference between malnourished and undernourishment. What I want you to make sure that you can do now is that you've got these key words down so that you know that distinction between the two. So again, pause the slide for me, guys, and get those key words down into your independent notes. Okay, so I said that we were going to look at lots of maps and graphs today, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to follow my steps for success, which we would normally go through in the class, and we're going to have a look at this first map, which you can see up here on the screen. Okay, so remember, my first step for success when analysing maps and graphs is to look at the title and to look at the key. So this is a map which shows us global undernourishment. Okay, and just to refresh your memory, undernourishment is when you do not have the right vitamins and minerals and a poorly balanced diet. We also need to look at the key. Now, this is a choropleth map, which means that it uses graduated shading depending upon the percentage of the population that are undernourished. So if I look at the key, I can see that where we've got this dark red, that means that more than 35% of the population are undernourished. Where I've got this yellow, it tells us that less than 5% of the world are undernourished. Okay, so if I start to have a look at the general trend that I can see on here, I can see that predominantly people that live in Europe are not undernourished. Okay, so the general trend that we've got down here is, if we look, Europe, less than 5% of people are undernourished. Similarly, North America, less than 5% of people are undernourished. Australia, less than 5% of people are undernourished. But there is one area of the world, and remember, we're on step 3 where we're using examples, where we have a high percentage of people that are undernourished, and that is Africa, particularly if we look at sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got lots of countries which are suffering from chronic undernourishment, okay? And we can see that by looking at the map quite clearly. There are some other places. So you've got Yemen over here in the Middle East. You've also got some countries in South America as well that suffer from undernourishment. But we've got the highest percentage of people that are undernourished in this particular area of the world around Africa. Now, where possible, we like to pick out some anomalies. And actually, looking at this, there isn't anything that strikes me as a massive anomaly, if I'm to be honest. The only one that perhaps maybe sticks out is North Korea, which you can see over here, because most of Asia suffers from relatively low levels of undernourishment. China is a slight exception, but it's really high in North Korea, and that's because of the government that's there, and some ongoing issues with famine, which are very, very complex, which we can go into when we start to study food in a little bit more detail. Okay, so title is telling us that it's global undernourishment. Key patterns and key trends: predominantly the wealthier HIC countries, Europe, North America, Australia, have very low percentages in terms of the population that are undernourished. LICs and poorer countries have much higher amounts of people that are undernourished, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa. And anomalies, not many, perhaps maybe North Korea, which we can pick out. So that gives us an idea that actually global food distribution is not even, okay? Now, World Health Organization guidance, and we know this from our last lesson, suggests that we need 2,000 to 2,400 calories per day. And it says that over 1 billion people are described as malnourished, and a further 2 billion people suffer from undernutrition. Now, if we work that out in terms of the amount of people that we've got on the planet at the moment, which is around 7.5 billion people, that means that 41% of the global population does not have sufficient access to food in order to be able to survive and live a long and healthy and prosperous life. I think that is staggering. 41% of the planet does not have access to enough food in order to live a healthy and balanced lifestyle. And it makes me feel very, very grateful for what I have got. So that's kind of food in terms of food distribution. What I want you to do now, because I think that these statistics are really important, I'd like you to just pause the screen for me and just make sure that you've got that information down about the global distribution for food in numbers. Okay, so let's have a little look at water and see if water picks that similar pattern in terms of wealth. So if we cast our minds back to units where we've looked at development, there are lots of different ways of measuring development. And the two most common ways are using GNP, which is gross national product, which is a measure of economic wealth. The higher the GNP, the higher the wealth of a particular country, and HDI, which is the Human Development Index. And the Human Development Index takes into account GNP, but it also takes into account life expectancy and literacy rate. So it's another measure of development. And where we've got the lowest rank, we end up with the more developed country. So if we look at the statistics that we've got here, okay, in terms of gross national product per head, Canada here is doing best. It's got $22,480 per person, and its HDI rank is 1, okay, which means that technically it has the best quality of life, okay. Then if we look at Australia, Australia again is a HIC, so it's got high levels of gross domestic product, and its Human Development Index rank is much higher. If we move down to Niger, Niger has got a low gross national product at around $850, and its Human Development Index rank is 173, and that's out of about 196 countries in the world. If we have a look at the amount of water that there is available per head, actually, if we move down this list, you can see that it is much less available. So in Australia, where we've got a really high level of gross national product and Human Development Index, there's lots of water to go around for people. When we start to look at Canada, again, we've got a lot of water per head. Saudi Arabia, less so. probably because of the dry and arid climate. But then when we get down to the poorest regions like Niger, we can see that they've got less cubic meters of water available per person. Okay, so that is absolutely colossal. We've got to be careful with the Australia figure. We've got to be careful with the Australia figure because of the population size and the size of the country, which means that it kind of looks like there's lots of water available, but actually Australia does suffer from water scarcity, which we'll have a look at it in a minute. So the question that I've put down the bottom is, so what is the link between development and the availability of water? Well, it seems quite clear. The more developed you are as a country, the richer you are as a country, the more water you've got available for your population. So let's kind of put that into perspective. The difference in water supply is usually down to the climate and the differences in rainfall. So if you've got lots of rainfall, you would expect that you'd be in a country that has lots of access to water. Simple as that. But it's not just about rainfall and climate, because money comes into it as well. If you've got a reliable source of water, that's all very well. But if you want to be able to provide water for your population, you need to be able to capture it. You need to be able to store it underground in aquifers. So aquifers are big underground storage units that are natural, but that you can extract water from through pipes and pumps and things like that. Unfortunately, for lots of poorer countries that do have enough climate, or they do have enough rainfall, they don't have the money to be able to do that, and it's expensive, and it actually requires lots of investment. And if you've got a lack of water, that leads to a cycle of poverty where you stay poor. And as we start to explore water in a bit more detail, we're going to look at that no water poverty cycle. Okay, so let's have a little look at the global distribution of water then, and let's go through those steps for success that we went through when we started to look at food. So the first step, title and key. So it says projected areas of water scarcity by 2025. Okay, now we can't understand this unless we know what the word scarcity means. So if something is scarce, it means that there's not enough of it. So where we've got water scarcity, it means that there's not enough water. Okay. Now, if we look at the key, there's different types of water scarcity. So you've got physical water scarcity. So that is where there is a lack of water. It just physically isn't there. So if you start thinking about deserts and really, really dry mountain ranges and things like that, okay, that's physical water scarcity. There physically isn't any water. So if we look across the Sahara Desert and around the Middle East, where we've got these big areas of desert, okay, that means that there's a big physical water scarcity. Then we get economic water scarcity. And economic water scarcity is where there is very little water available, but also not necessarily that there's so little water that you can't use it, but it's that you cannot afford to exploit the water resources. So remember, that word economic means money. So if you've got an economic water scarcity, there might be water there, but it's expensive and it's difficult to be able to get to it, okay? And that creates a barrier and that creates a problem. So if we go through our steps for success, let's look at the general trend. So in general, the Northern Hemisphere suffers from little or no water scarcity. So if we look at Europe again, little or no water scarcity, plenty of water to be able to go around. North America, little or no water scarcity, plenty of water to go around, and it's the same across Russia. If we start looking at the areas where we've got physical water scarcity, well, we're talking about this band here where we've got lots of deserts. So we've got the Middle East and we've got Northern Africa, also South Africa as well, where there's physical water scarcity. The water physically doesn't exist, so you can't get to it. Then we get economic water scarcity. And the biggest area of economic water scarcity is, again, Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, so just south of the Sahara Desert. There you've got an absolute economic water scarcity. So people cannot afford to be able to get to those resources. Now, if we have a little look, we've also got some anomalies on here. And actually, I'm really surprised by Australia and New Zealand. I'm not surprised that they suffer from water scarcity, particularly Australia, because it's got a big, huge desert in the middle. But it's actually categorized as economic water scarcity. So perhaps water is so scarce in those countries that it is difficult for them to be able to extract the water supplies. Really interesting that, to start thinking about the patterns. Now, we're going to be looking at this for our question at the end of this lesson. Okay, so we will go back to this map and explore it in a bit more detail. So let's have a little look at energy then, which is our third and final resource. So energy is needed for economic development. if we don't have energy, we don't have factories, we don't have businesses, we don't have machines, we don't have transport, and all of those things support countries in getting wealthier and getting richer. So in the past, lots of countries would have been dependent upon their own energy resources, and we call that energy security. But actually, it's really complicated these days, because what we can do is we can trade energy with other countries. So in the UK, for example, we no longer rely on our resources of coal, because we can import oil from other countries, we can import coal from other countries, and all of those things have created a global trade in energy. And as the world becomes more developed, as we said earlier, we're going to consume more energy. So the richest people in the world use far more energy than the poorest people in the world. And where we've got those needs, those newly emerging economies that are becoming richer, they're going to demand more and more energy. Okay, that could have big problems for the planet unless we can make that shift to using more renewable energies over fossil fuels. So again, what I would like you guys to do is to just pause it on this slide and just see if you can add your own independent notes about the global distribution of energy. Okay then, guys. Right, so what I want us to do now is I would like us to go back to that original question, which says, explain what figure C tells us about the global distribution of water. So let's just focus on water. I know we've looked at food, I know we've looked at water, and I know we've looked at energy. But let's just have a little look and see what it tells us. So here's the map that I introduced you to earlier, which has got the areas of physical water scarcity, economic water scarcity, and areas where there is little or no water scarcity. So if we look at this question, there's a command word in it, and the command word is explain. And explain says, what are the reasons for what you can see? So this is actually quite a complicated question, because we've got to give reasons. If we describe something, all we're doing is saying what we can see. So if I describe this graph, or this map, sorry, I can use my steps for success. I can say that there's little or no water scarcity in the Northern Hemisphere, around the UK and around Europe and North America. I can say that there's lots of economic water scarcity in sub-Saharan Africa, and that there's physical water scarcity in areas where we've got a dry climate, such as the Sahara Desert in the Middle East. Okay, that by and large is describing. I'm just saying what I can see. Now, what we need to do is to follow that step for success, not only to describe the patterns that we've got on the map, but also to be able to give some explanations. So start your answer off by saying what it is a map of. So it's a map which shows us the projected areas of water scarcity by 2025. Follow the general trends. Tell me the areas that have physical water scarcity, tell me the areas that have economic water scarcity, and tell me the areas that have no or little water scarcity. Try and pick out some anomalies if you can. So remember, we talked about Australia and New Zealand and how they might potentially not fit the pattern that we would expect, particularly when we look at economic water scarcity between some of those richer and poorer countries. And remember, once you've described it, you've got to explain the reasons for what you can see. Well, economic water scarcity exists in sub-Saharan Africa because the countries are poor. And because those countries are poorer, they cannot afford to be able to get to the water resources which are stored under the ground. They can't afford to clean the water resources so that the people within their populations can use them. If we start looking at physical water scarcity, well, here we've got very, very dry environments and we've got predominantly desert. Okay, and that's what's causing that very, very physical water scarcity. There is physically not any water there. And then if we start looking at where there's no water scarcity, it tends to be across our temperate climates where we get lots of rainfall, okay, throughout the course of the year, and where we've got richer countries that can extract the water. So what I've done is I've written a little bit of a model answer just to kind of guide you through it. And what I've done is I've marked on it S1, S2, S3, and S4, depending on which step for success it is that I'm looking at. But then I've also put in brackets the word explanation when I've actually been not just describing what I can see on the map, I've been explaining what I can see on the map. So I'd suggest that you have a good look at this before you answer the question yourself so that you can see where I would be guiding my way through each of those different steps. So I said the map shows the areas across the world where it is predicted that there will be water scarcity by 2025. So I've just read the title from the map. In general, the continents in the Northern Hemisphere do not suffer from water scarcity. Step 2, because what I've done is I've just described the general pattern. An example of this is Europe. Step 3, I've given an example. This is because the climate is not as warm and there is plenty of precipitation or rainfall. That's my explanation, okay? Africa suffers from economic water scarcity. Again, step 2, because I'm describing the pattern that I can see. This is because many of the countries in Africa lack the money to store and process water. That's my explanation. Areas such as the Middle East suffer from physical water scarcity. Again, step 2, because I've just described what I can see in the general pattern. This is because the climate is dry and there's not much precipitation. So that's my explanation. I've given reasons for it, okay? I know why it's dry and why there's a physical water scarcity. It's because it doesn't rain. An anomaly includes Australia. So step 4 now, I'm looking at my anomalies. This is a HIC, which would expect not to suffer from economic water scarcity. This could be because they have such a warm and dry climate. That's my explanation. Might not be the reason, but at least I've given the examiner, I've given the person marking this answer some information to go on in terms of my explanation. So what I want you guys to do now then is to have another look at the model answer if you need to, but see if you can write a response to this question. Can you explain what figure C tells us about the global distribution of water? Next lesson, we're going to start to look at food in a little bit more detail before moving on to look at water and looking at energy. If you need any support in the meantime, all you've got to do is get in touch and let me know.